I am an economist, and economics has been described as the science of telling you things you've known your whole life, but in a language you can't understand. So what I'm going to speak to you about is actually from my latest book, which is just out, called The Great Crashes. So you've heard the saying, there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. I'm going to add a third. There will be another financial banking crash. However, they do not have to result in massive economic misery and a global meltdown. So this book is looking at a century of financial crises and looking at what we can learn to make sure that when the next inevitable crash happens, it doesn't drag all of us down with them. So the subtitle, Lessons from Global Meltdowns and How to Prevent Them, is essentially the focus of what I'm going to speak to you about today. And there's 3 phases that are common to every financial crash. And I'm going to go through those and see if we could just pick out a few lessons to make sure when the next crash happens, the worst doesn't follow. I'm going to start with a quote by J.K. Galbraith, who said, "There can be few fields of human endeavor in which history counts for so little as in the world of finance. Past experience, to the extent that it is part of memory at all, is dismissed as the primitive refuge of those who do not have the insight to appreciate the incredible wonders of the present." So, Mark Twain actually said it best. He said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." So I'm going to look at a couple of past episodes in history and take us forward to very similar episodes which are happening today and see if we can learn those lessons, because every crash is different, but they do share similar traits. So the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s, that was actually the worst banking crisis in the United States, the most costly bailout until the US subprime crisis of 2008. At that point in the 80s, at least one savings and loan, so think of those as banking associations, failed in each of the 50 United States. And the story of the S&L crisis has a parallel to today because the US just this year has seen a number of mid-sized US banks fail. And when I say mid-size, it just means they're less regulated than the biggest banks. However, the 3 banks that failed earlier this year are among the top 5 biggest bank rescues in US history. The only one which is bigger was in 2008 when Washington Mutual failed. The 5th biggest bank failure in US history was during the 2008 S&L crisis. So what happened and what can we learn? You see there, how many of you have seen the film, It's a Wonderful Life? Okay. If you haven't, please do. It reaffirms your faith in humanity. So in the story, Jimmy Stewart plays a character who uses some of his honeymoon funds. Oh, by the way, he stays married throughout the film, in case you're worried now. He uses some of his money to actually save a local S&L, which is going to be taken over by a robber baron. That's how important savings and loans were to communities they lent money to, specifically mortgages. However, the S&Ls got into a huge amount of trouble when their model began to fail in the 1970s and 80s. So they operated on what was known as a 3-6-3 model. They took in deposits and paid out 3% interest. They lent mortgages and earned 6% interest. And they got to go on the golf course by 3 p.m. So when interest rates shot up in the 1970s, the model failed. And the bankers began to bet the house. And in a sense, they took on risks too much, lent too much, and their failures, as I say, triggered the worst systemic crisis in history. They were hastened by junk bond king Michael Milken. And the 80s saw SNLs also become embroiled in political scandal when the Keating Five, which were 5 US senators, which were supported by an SNL owner, Charles Keating, when he was asked, "Did you bribe these 5 senators to rescue your SNL?" Charles Keating said, "Well, I surely do hope my bribes have paid off." So, as we've heard, crime, fraud, all of this became what SNLs became embroiled in the 1980s. So immediately the lessons here are, there's always going to be fraud in every crisis, but is there a lesson we can draw to today? The lesson is this: just because at the moment it's mid-sized US banks doesn't mean that the US current banking crisis couldn't trigger something larger, because this crisis lasted for years in the 1980s. And if you have enough mid-sized banks or smaller banks, it can still be systemic, in which case resolving the banks quickly and credibly is one of the lessons to learn. The second one is about euphoria. So this is the trait that every bubble shares. So the dot-com crash of 2000, 2001 was an extraordinary run-up in the US stock market. The NASDAQ, which is the tech-heavy market, increased by 440%. This is when we heard about irrational exuberance. So think back to the 1990s. It was possible to buy things on the internet instead of having to go to a physical store. It was amazing then. So money piled into e-commerce, even though at the time, very few households had broadband. So do you remember what a dial-up modem is? Oh, thank goodness. Okay. So, you need to get on the internet, and somebody else wants to use a telephone, and they're like, "Get off the internet, I need to use the phone." You could barely get on the internet, and there were millions piled into these companies that were building fancy websites nobody could actually get to. So the whole thing collapsed in 18 months, and it triggered a US recession, and the NASDAQ only recovered 15 years later. So I'm going to speak in a moment about the current tech crash, slowdown, and see if we can draw a lesson about exuberance from that. So what do these 2 episodes show in terms of lessons from history? In order to prevent the next crash from becoming a global meltdown, we need to watch out for euphoria. Now, everyone is subject to FOMO. This is the reason why we always have bubbles and crises, because you don't know if you're missing out on a fundamental change like e-commerce, or it's just another bubble. So the lesson here is, by all means, be euphoric, be exuberant. However, don't do it by borrowing too much money, because it's always the debt that gets you if you can't repay it. So euphoria fueled by debt is the debt part. That's the first phase of every major crash. The second phase is about how you resolve it, and that's about credibility and being quick. So the US banking crisis now, the speed of the Fed in resolving it is absolutely crucial. And then the aftermath. I'm going to show you a chart about the number of banking crises we've had in the last century. The aftermath is worse after a banking crisis because it requires a period of repaying debt, which is known as deleveraging, and requires restoring confidence, and that takes time. So, to today, we have very similar valuations before the tech crash in November 2021, where the high flyers, the internet companies of today, if you compare their valuations with the dot-com era, they were rather similar. So one difference already is one of the fundamentals today are better. More households do have broadband. However, the euphoria around it is also very similar. So whether or not the current tech slowdown generates a massive crash, it depends on how much debt has been fueling the exuberance. And because a lot of this is coming from private equity and private credit, it's actually hard to tell. But this is why it's important to look back at 2000 and see whether or not there are warning signs in some of these tech stocks that we should all watch out for. The second phase, credibility, I'm going to give you two examples. So the UK in 1992 experienced a currency crisis known as the European Exchange Rate Mechanism crisis. Mexico had a peso crisis in 1994, also a currency crisis. Mexico had a massive recession and required a rescue, including by the United States. The UK had a really good 1990s. What was the difference? It was the credibility of institutions. So the UK government acted quickly. Nobody questioned the credibility of the Bank of England after the crisis in the currency market, but they questioned the credibility of Mexican institutions. So credibility is such a key issue. This is my second example of it. European Central Bank President Mario Draghi essentially turned the corner on the euro crisis by giving his whatever it takes speech. So I was actually there at Lancaster House when he gave it in London, right before the Olympics. So he said to the audience, "You do not understand the political commitment behind the euro, and that we will do whatever it takes to preserve the single currency." And markets believed him. So you can see the spreads, which is how much creditors wanted to lend to European countries, actually came down dramatically after his speech. In my book, I write about Timothy Geithner, the US Treasury Secretary, who went to the ECB afterwards and said, "Tell me about this amazing speech. How did you come up with it? What lied behind it?" And he found out Mario Draghi had ad-libbed it. He made it up. But it worked because the other political leaders stood behind him, and they did give him a program to do some bond buying, which is what markets had wanted. But he never used the bond buying program because the speech itself was viewed as credible. And then the final example is the aftermath. Banking failures are the worst, and this is why debt is so important. So if you want to safeguard the economy going forward, making sure that people have income, have access to their savings, firms have access to liquidity. All of these things are hugely important because when a banking failure happens, the worst outcomes are prolonged recessions, and people and viable businesses suffer. And we've had a lot of banking crises, and we will surely have another one. So the next great crash I'm going to talk about is a potential banking crash. Those of you who are looking at the photo might recognize that is in China. I was given advice as a young economist. You can predict either the event or the timing, but never both. So China is overdue to have a great crash. 40 years without a great crash is highly unusual. So it's only a matter of time. But what's the impact we should be watching out for? It's this. China is actually the biggest lender in the world, bigger than the World Bank, bigger than the Paris Club of Advanced Economies. If China were to crash and pulls its money back, then it could trigger a developing country crisis, and that's why we all need to pay attention to what's happening there. I'm going to finish with some thoughts about the Great Reset. So I start the book in 1929 with the great crash of Wall Street then, and the book goes all the way up, actually, to the Russia-Ukraine cost of living crisis. But the lesson I want to focus on is the Great Reset. So this term has been used in various ways since the pandemic because we have actually reset. We've changed the ways in which we live and we work. So one of the things that I'm hopeful about is the Great Reset in terms of having a fair and a greener world. Debt levels are hugely high as a result of the pandemic, but throughout the pandemic period, there's actually been not less, but more support for a greener world, for moving towards a fairer world where people get income support. And the IMF has changed its mind. It's now saying if you can invest public money, it can create more green jobs, it can expand the economy, even though there's great uncertainty and debt levels are high. So to me, there is a sea change in the way that we can think about the world, and the pandemic, awful as it is, has given us the opportunity to do that. And the second change I just want to focus on for a moment is the Great Resignation. This is the reset on how we live and we work. This is a survey of US workers. They were asked, if your boss told you to come back to the office 5 days a week, what would you do? You can see 57.8% would just come back. Over a third would come back and then secretly look for a working from home job, probably at work. Another 6% would just quit. No, thank you. So this behavioral change is likely to stay with us. And the key here is the use of technology. Zoom IPO'd before the pandemic, but we didn't actually use it until the pandemic. So using technology should be able to free us up in order to have a better work-life balance. So of all of the lessons that I've drawn around what we do in a crisis, how you spot a bubble, how you resolve a banking crash, to me, this would be the most satisfying lesson from a century of financial crises is maybe, just maybe, we can just reset. Maybe we can change the way in which we live and work, and we don't have to always repeat what has come before. And if we do, let's repeat it, but do it better. Thank you very much.